Good morning, everybody, and it's great to see such good numbers. I'm going to assume that's about interest in equality and human rights and not large pots of money available. But so yeah, my name is Barney. I work in the public sector duty team in the Irish Human Rights and Commission, but I am formerly of this parish, so I did spend about 18 years working in local authority. I was in Monaghan County Council, so very familiar with the pressures and demands that you're all under. So I'll try and be as efficient as possible. So this morning, I'm just going to bring you through equality and human rights in the European Social Infrastructure Funds, and where we, as the Irish Human Rights Commission, have recommended how bodies, projects and managing authorities can be compliant with those EU regulations in relation to equality and human rights, and then specifically around the Thrive scheme. So if you want to move to the next slide, please, Rose. So just for those of you who might not be familiar, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission are Ireland's national equality and human rights institution. We are an independent public body appointed by the President, and we are directly accountable to the Oireachtas. And we have a statutory remit to promote and protect equality and human rights, and to build a culture of respect for human rights and equality and intercultural understanding in Ireland. As the National Human Rights and Equality Institute, we have then a specific role to play in the monitoring and adherence of equality and human rights in the European Structural Investment Funds, as they are set out in the regulations governing the EU funds. And any of you familiar with equality and human rights in public service, you will know that the advancement of equality and human rights in Ireland very much came following our joining the European Union. So it's very much influenced by that. Next slide, Rose. So in relation to supporting equality and human rights in the funds, so as part of our monitoring role, we have worked with the managing authorities in a number of areas, and what we have produced and agreed on that, we have an equality and human rights in EU funds guidance document and supporting checklists, which I was sent to Rose for circulation, and that really just sets out what the rules are and how you can be compliant, whether you're a managing authority, an intermediate body, or a project beneficiary. And then there's a supporting checklist that goes along with that, and that's just really to cross-check. Have you actually done the steps that are recommended in that guidance? Part of the role in IREC in relation to the EU funds is reporting on progress that has been made in relation to equality and human rights in the funds, and that involves capturing the progress from basically from the projects and from the managing authorities who administer the funds, and there's a tool around capturing that. We also have an equality and human rights in the public service e-learning. It's a free learning module for anybody who wants to learn a little bit more about equality and human rights in the public service, and I will also send a link to that to Rose. And we also have delivered training workshops across the managing authorities to support their understanding and application of equality and human rights in the funds. So next slide, Rose, thanks. So just to give you a little bit of a context, I was saying to Rose earlier, I'm not assuming any level of knowledge, because I myself, when I go to training and something's spoken about that I don't know anything about, and everybody else appears to, there's no way you're going to ask. So I'll just give you the context of the EU funds and where equality and human rights sits in. So there is approximately about 1/3 of the EU budget goes across 8 funds, and those 8 funds aim to meet 5 objectives that have been set by the EU. I won't go into what they are. I think 5 of those 8 funds are in Ireland. The European Regional Development Fund, the ESFF, Just Transition. So they're the funds, and within that then there is a common provision regulation, and that's essentially the rule book for the rolling out of those funds by the EU member states. And within that common provision regulation, there is a focus on equality and human rights. And if you so wish to read it, there's endless pages of very complicated EU language, but essentially when people are talking about the Common Provision Regulation, the CPR, it is the rules for rolling out the funds. And in the current period that we're in, the 2021 to 2027 period, there has been an intensified focus on equality and human rights. And they are found in that CPR document, in the regulations, under enabling conditions and a horizontal principle. So the enable conditions are conditions that must be met by the member state, and they must remain fulfilled and respected throughout the programming period. And 5 of those enabling conditions relate to equality and human rights. And then the horizontal principle, by its name, is horizontal. It goes right across the programme, all of the funds, all of the objectives, and there is one of the horizontal principles in relation to equality and human rights, and it's a cross-cutting policy objective. Next slide, Rose. So the enabling conditions, so 2 of the enabling conditions that are conditions that must be respected throughout the whole programme. 2 of them relate to all projects, all funded activities, all objectives, and they are the effective application of and implementation of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, and the implementation and application of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with a Disability. So essentially what's that? That is saying that everything that is funded from the European Social Investment Funds, whether it's a Thrive project or whether it's an education project, they must be effective in implementing the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And the Charter of Fundamental Rights is basically the Bible of fundamental rights in the EU, of which all the other treaties in that fall down. I will send an easy to read version of that for people, but it is the basic rights that everybody who lives in an EU member state has the right to. It was established under the Lisbon Treaty, if people remember. And then the implementation of the UNCRPD, the Convention on the Rights of People with a Disability. Ireland has signed that. It's ratified it in 2018. And there is a list of articles within that by signing it, Ireland has agreed that they will follow those articles to ensure that people with a disability have the same rights and opportunities as everybody else in Ireland. So they're the 2 enabling conditions that are very relevant to Thrive. Next slide, Rose. And then 3 of the 5 enabling conditions relate to specific objectives of the fund, so very specific projects, and they're named within those funds, and that is that a national, the government must have in place a strategic framework for gender equality, a strategic framework for social inclusion and poverty, and a national Roma integration strategy. So in order for Ireland to draw down funds, they must have these frameworks in place at the beginning of the period and right throughout. I know that at the beginning of the period, Ireland had these policies in place. Some of them expired, and I do believe there has been an agreement with the EU in relation to the ones that went, that are out of date and currently being developed, so that funding can continue to be drawn down. So next slide, Rose. The horizontal principle is, again, that right across all the objectives, that in the preparation, implementation, monitoring, reporting, and evaluation of programs, the member state must ensure that there is a respect for the fundamental rights and compliance of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which we spoke about earlier, ensure that there is equality between men and women, and gender mainstreaming, and take any appropriate steps to prevent any discrimination based on gender, race, ethnic origin, religion, belief, disability, age, or sexual orientation. So by Ireland signing up for that, Ireland as a member state agreeing to take the European Social Funds into Ireland, they've agreed, and their agreement mechanism is that involving IREC as the Human Rights Equality Institute. Next slide. So compliance mechanisms. So they're the rules, that they are what the EU have said. If you want these funds, you must spend them in this way, and these are the rules that you must have in relation to equality and human rights. So IREG, as the National Human Rights Equality body, worked with the managing authorities to identify, well, how can we ensure that funding and projects funded under our EU funds are compliant with the rules that are set out. And part of that, we identified compliance mechanisms, and essentially these are the two steps that we think, if you implement these in your projects, in your funding, in your program, in your plan, you will meet the requirements that are set out in the EU rules. So the guidance document sets this out in further detail, and I was, as I said, I will send this on for everybody to look at. But just to give you an idea of it, of what it contains, we've identified that by using the public sector duty, some of you may be familiar with that, is a key element of how you can ensure that you're meeting the obligations that are set out for equality and human rights in the EU rules. And then the national policy strategies are the other element. So the policy strategies that were developed by government that fulfill those enabling conditions, there are actions and goals in all of those that can be subsequently implemented through EU funds projects, and that's where they're the two steps that we feel will support projects, managing authorities, and anyone who are using the funds or accessing the funds to meet the objectives. So the next slide, please. So looking at the first step and the first element we have identified as helping compliance with the EU regulations is the public sector duty. The public sector duty is found in section 42 of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Act 2014. That is the act that established IREG. And it says within that, a public body, of which both the Regional Assembly and the local authorities are, shall, in the performance of its functions, have regard to the need to eliminate discrimination, promote equality of opportunity and treatment of its staff and persons to whom it provides services, and to protect the human rights of its members and the persons to whom it provides services. So that is the piece of legislation. As an organisation within your corporate plan, the work of the local authority is subject to this, but we have also identified that the steps that are recommended to meet this particular statutory obligation will also help you fulfill the EU regulations. So the next slide. And then the national policy strategies are the second element of how you can meet, and that is that in the range of national policy strategies, that the development and implementation of these policy strategies respond to the requirements that are set out in the enabling conditions and the horizontal equality of human rights principles. So in the implementation plan for the Southern Regional Assembly, they would have identified within the national policy strategies where the work that they're planning to do across their funds can actually support the implementation of some of those actions. And it also is an opportunity for saying, well, look, this project that we're going to do will actually support the implementation of that. So they're the two ways in which, so next slide, sorry. The strategies that are in place set out there, the two that are relevant for all objectives is the comprehensive employment strategy for people with a disability and the National Disability Inclusion Strategy. And then the three national policies that are relevant to the named specific objectives, the National Strategy for Women and Girls, the Roadmap for Social Inclusion, and the National Traveller and Roma Inclusion Strategy. So you'll see there that some of them are out of date. They are in progress for implementation, but for the purpose of Thrive, the public sector duty is probably the more relevant and the more important one, but it's just good to know that the other element of that. Next slide, please. So when we recommended that the public sector duty was the element of where projects could meet their obligations under the EU funds. It is specifically around the steps involved in implementing the public sector duty. So under the legislation, public sector duties are requested to carry out a 3-step approach, which is assess, address, report. So the assess step is to set out in its strategic plan an assessment of the human rights and equality issues it believes to be relevant to the function and purpose of the body, and present that in a manner that is accessible to the public. The address step is to set out in your strategic plan the policies, plans and actions that you have in place or propose to put in place that will address the issues that you identified in the assessment process. And then step 3 is about reporting on the progress in your annual report, the progress that you've made in relation to identifying the human rights and equality issues and addressing them. So that step approach is where we're saying when you are developing your plan or a project or an activity, if taking that at that step. So an assessment is looking at what you're planning to do and what equality and human rights issues are within that. And it isn't saying that you will know them. It might be a case of having to go and find out. And then once you've identified what potentially might be equality and human rights issues, how do you propose to remove those barriers or to address those issues? And then reporting on the progress, so that you would say, well, look, we figured that this might be an issue. We put in place this particular action to address that issue. And then in reporting, this is what we've achieved. This is what we've improved for people. And it's the people who are protected under the equality legislation. So the next slide, Rose, thanks. So we have identified that when you're using the duty in relation to EU funds, it will involve you looking at whatever plan, program, scheme or initiative that you are planning. And this is all about looking, and I think that's the importance, I suppose, of having a session on the duty and the equality regulations today before applications are made. It's about identifying in advance issues that might be that might need to be addressed within, and that's about identifying in your communities, in your areas where maybe you've identified a building or identified the resettlement area, that you would say, okay, we need to identify the issues in that community that are relevant to the project or the plan that we're going to seek funding under, and what we're going to do to make sure that these issues are adequately and appropriately addressed in the plan. And then reporting annually on the progress that you made. So for example, if you identified that, right, there's an old library building in the town, it hasn't been used for years, and we think it would be a great information centre for the community. In an assessment of that, you would be looking at saying, right, we need to consider the needs of people with a disability and the accessibility of that building. We need to consider the needs of maybe people from a migrant background, people from the traveller community, people from the LGBT community. And it's not just about issues, but it's also about saying, well, look, if we were to use that centre, use this plan, how would we ensure that there is no barriers to anybody protected under the ground who live in the community from enjoying the outcome of the EU fund, essentially. Next slide, please, Rose. So the concepts underpinning the duty. So this is really just when we talk about promotion of equality of opportunity, discrimination and human, what does that actually mean? And so in the three concepts of the duty, discrimination, equality and human rights, what we're actually talking about in the preparation, development, implementation and evaluation of your project, of what you're planning to do, you need to consider how you will deliver this project in a way that people who live in your community or groups of people who live in your community are not treated less favorably because of the characteristics or their identity. And it's important in discrimination to recognize that discrimination can be indirect. So it can be unintentional, but because you didn't really consider the needs, discrimination still exists. So it may be, well, we're going to make this wonderful activity space, and we're going to have a space for children to come and enjoy, but you don't consider children with a disability. And when it opens up, there are no opportunities for disabled children to engage in whatever activities. You didn't mean to, but because you didn't consider, then you have discriminated indirectly against children with disabilities, and they don't have the same opportunity. Equality in the duty is it doesn't mean treating everybody the same. Equality is about recognizing that some people need different supports and different steps in order for them to have the same opportunity as somebody else. So in your project preparation, in your development, in the implementation and the evaluation, you need to consider, are there things we need to do differently to ensure that everybody can avail of what the end product we hope to be? The whole idea of the equality and human rights in the EU funds is that everybody who lives in the EU benefits from this enormous investment that has been allocated. And it shouldn't be that right down at the very local level that maybe a traveller woman doesn't avail of the training opportunity that takes place because the information about it didn't reach her because it wasn't accessible, or that migrant communities aren't even aware that a building is being refurbished and redeveloped because the way in which consultation happened in the community about the redevelopment didn't reach them. That's where you have to make sure there is equal opportunity, that everybody has the same opportunity to engage with whatever it is you hope to fund. It doesn't mean everybody will. If you have a lovely heritage building that's redeveloped into a community, that doesn't mean everybody in the community will be there, but it shouldn't be because they can't or that they don't even know about it. And then the next slide, Rose, please. And then in the protection of people's human rights. The human rights in the duty are the liberties, freedoms, and guarantees that are in the Irish Constitution and in any treaty that Ireland has signed up to. So we spoke about those earlier, the Fundamental Charter of Human Rights, the UNCRPD. They're pretty much based on the same concepts of discrimination and equality, but you should, in the design and development of a project, ensure that anybody engaging, that might be human rights protecting around non-discrimination, it might be around dignity, respect, things like if you're refurbishing a public building, the human rights of dignity and respect may be the consideration of toilet facilities for adults who require changing facilities, a public changing space. So often you have toilets facilities that allow, for changing nappies and pads for children. There are adults with disabilities and adults with conditions, and they require space to change an adult incontinence place. So having their human rights protected and dignity and respect means they're not, maybe having to do that on a floor space or having to leave. They're the kind of things that you're considering, and you will find that out by engaging with the people who are protected. Next slide, Rose. So that's the next bit I'm going to kind of focus on, where the relevance of all of this is to the Thrive projects and applications and stuff. But that's kind of just what we're talking about in the equality and human rights in the funds and how you can go about doing it. I don't think this is hugely new to local authorities. In the practice, maybe the theory of it is different, but I know just from working in local authorities that consultation, engagement with public participation networks, age-friendly programs, disability programs, resettlement programs means that local authorities are very clued in with their communities and very aware of difficulties. So this is just putting a structure on all of that. Okay, so just moving on to the application of all of that that we spoke about earlier to the Thrive scheme. So as Rose had spoke about earlier, it supports locally developed plans that assist creating town centres that function as viable, vibrant, attractive locations for people to live, work, visit while functioning as a business service, social, cultural, recreational hub for the local community. So that's kind of where I've looked at in terms of where the relevance of equality and human rights sits within that. So next slide, Rose. So this is where you're looking at the Thrive scheme. So it supports 10 centres that function for people. So the people who are protected under our equality law, the groups, the grounds of the equality law, they are members of every community, every society across the country. So once you have an initiative or a project that is for people, all of the grounds are relevant. If you want people to live, work and visit and function for the local community, the people and the local community, the two key aspects, and who they are. And when you take that approach, kind of looking at who are the public in the public sector duty, so people with disabilities, people from migrant backgrounds, traveller communities, older people, young people, women, men, members of the LGBT community live in every single community in Ireland. Now, when you look to engage or identify issues, it may not be relevant. You know, it may not be relevant for every aspect, but you need to consider and say, well, in this instance, religion maybe isn't an issue, or maybe it is. Maybe the building used to be a particular denominational building, and maybe there's historical sensitivities around that. And you know, if you don't ask that question, then you won't find out. And maybe you have people who have ideas around maybe acknowledging or recognizing. So it's about considering all of, but the relevance is, if it's to function for people to live, work and visit, it has to function for all of the people. So it can't just be something that functions for some, because then that is not compliant with what the EU funds are all about. So if you have a building that somebody who has a visual impairment can't independently access and engage in, then it doesn't function for all the people who live in your community. So that's kind of, if you're looking at, so going back, sorry, Rose, next slide. So what I'm talking about there, the public in the public sector duty, every local authority has done a local economic and community plan at this stage, I'm sure, and there is a socioeconomic profile as part of that. So there is data on your community available to you. But just to give you an idea of Ireland, when you look at Ireland at the minute, there are 800,000 people over 65 living in Ireland. That has increased by almost 20%. Sorry? Is that somebody asking me a question, or it's just, sorry. So that's increased by 23.5% in 2017. There's an age-friendly programme in every local authority. All of this information and how that dramatically increasing older population in communities, and all the information around that that's already there. In relation to somebody's muted me. Is everything okay? There's just somebody on the, is somebody's got their microphone unmuted? Is that what I'm hearing? Or is there?
It is, yeah. Bernie, you're okay to continue.
Okay, sorry about that. 14% of the population have come to live in Ireland, and so that's dynamic. The next slide, Rose. People with a disability in Ireland in 2022. That's the age profile of people with a disability. It is increased by 11% since the last census, and you can see there people who have challenges or difficulty in engaging in activities to some extent, to a greater extent. So it's important to, I mean, these people that are represented in graphs here, they live in every community and their particular needs are what you're talking about. You cannot be identifying a plan or a project that meets the commitments of Thrive and what Thrive aims to, function for the community, unless you consider all of the people who are living in the community. The local economic plan in your area will have all of that information, and will have engaged in a consultation on issues, and it's quite recent, so it would be an opportunity to engage with the information that's there. Next slide, Rose. So looking at if you're going to develop a plan, or if you're going to engage with your community to develop a plan and consult about a plan, the public part of the public sector duty. So the NALA stats would tell us that 1 in 6 Irish adults have difficulty with the written word. So if you're going to host information sessions and consultation sessions, 1 in 6 people will have difficulty engaging with that if it's only available in written word. 1 in 4 people have difficulty with numbers and basic maths. 42% of Irish adults describe themselves as being below average for digital skills. So if you're going to have a public consultation, 42% of the population in Ireland have said, we don't really have great skills. So that means if you're only going to have a survey monkey to capture the views of people, you're only going to capture the views of 60% of the population. So these are the things that you need to consider. 17% of the population were born outside of Ireland, and where that becomes relevant is where people who maybe are from migrant communities or different, where they access information about what's happening in the community. Some people have good English, conversational English, don't have great reading and writing skills in English. Some people don't have any skills in English. So if you are providing an opportunity to develop a plan that functions for all of the community, 17% of the community have maybe particular issues and challenges that you need to consider if you want to find out their opinion and their view. 32% of the population don't speak English well. 22% of the population have a disability, and that is right across the spectrum. So people have, physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, intellectual disabilities, people have multiple disabilities, and there are people who care for all of those people with disabilities. So how do you capture their views, and how do you ensure that what you're planning will actually provide equal opportunity for those people? And over 1 million people are over 65 in Ireland, and that is significant, and it's very significant in local authorities, particularly in towns that are being revived a lot. You'll have a lot of older population, maybe people living on their own. I know in Monaghan, a lot of older people lived in very rural communities, and there was no transport, and so the engagement with age-friendly and the older people's engagement is important. Do you capture their opinion, and that you're ensuring that what you're putting together is actually going to function and support that percentage of the population, which is significant. The next slide, Rose, thanks. So in our work, these are the kind of things that we would be rather than going from statistics and data, these are real people that we have engaged with through our grants program, through our legal rights stuff, and these, people like us, Oksana and Adam, live in every town in Ireland and every region in Ireland, but it's those particular issues. So somebody living in an accommodation centre with other families from Ukraine, she uses a wheelchair to assist her mobility. She doesn't read and write or speak English, and the Irish culture is very different, that she doesn't really understand how to access or join local events. So if you're planning a consultation or planning to develop a town centre plan, how do you know that you've captured the views of somebody like Oksana, who lives in your community and has equal right to participate in whatever the local authority is planning under the Thrive scheme? Adam is legally blind and has a mild intellectual disability. He'd like to go to college and get a job like his older brothers. There doesn't seem to be opportunities for Adam when he finishes school, and he's worried he's left behind. So people like Adam living in the community, how do you ensure what you're planning captures his needs and identifies barriers that might exist for him to enjoy the outcome of what a Thrive project will provide. Next slide. Again, these are just other characters that we have developed. Takeda lives in a direct provision centre with his family 5 miles outside the nearest town, speaks some English, but can't read and write English yet. He has a smartphone, but there's very poor broadband at the centre. He would love to find out supports and services. He doesn't know where to look. So this again is thinking of, okay, we're going to put everything out in social media, or we're going to have, you know, we're going to have an online survey. You're not going to capture people who don't have access to broadband or don't have the skills to engage in digital. So the public sector duty and makes you consider all of those people and ensure that what you're planning to do provides equal opportunity for people who don't have digital skills, who can't read and write, who don't speak English, who may have physical disability and can't get into a particular building. They're all the things that when we talk about an assessment of equality and human rights issues. Maggie is a 40-year-old traveller woman. Like many traveller women, she left school early. Her reading and writing skills are not great. Sometimes her kids help her. She sees leaflets and posters in her local centre, but she doesn't understand them, so she never takes them. So this is just like, we're kind of just given, when you're, I suppose, starting the process, that you have people like Takeda and Maggie and Adam in your head and in your mind. You don't need to know what those issues are. But you do need to ask and find out, and local authorities are in a great position to access local communities and local community structures that represent people who are protected under the 9 grounds. So next slide, Rose. So the Thrive programme, if we are applying what we're recommending under the public sector duty, the assessment of equality and human rights issues, what is the aim and the purpose of your project? So what are you planning to do? So if it's developing a town centre plan, you want to develop a plan that does what? Is it aimed at a specific group? Or is it for everyone? So obviously if it's a community group, it's a community, so it's everybody. So have you engaged with people from those groups who are protected under the duty to make sure that you're capturing their needs? Did you provide equal opportunity for people to engage in a public consultation? Was there steps taken to make sure that people who can't speak English, people who don't communicate verbally, people who have visual impairment, people who can't fill out an online survey, people who can't get to a physical building for a meeting, is there an opportunity for them to have their voice heard? It doesn't necessarily mean that all of those people in the community will make their voice heard, but they should have the opportunity to do it. And have you ensured that you've considered and accommodated the needs of people in the community? And an important part of consultation is ensuring that people understand the scope and the real, so look, we are limited by X, we're limited by Y, and you feed back to people. A consultation isn't a wish list for everything, and that people leave the room or leave the engagement with the feeling that everything that they have requested is going to happen. It's okay to say we won't be able to do everything, but it is important that whatever is decided provides the same opportunity for everyone, and you've taken those steps to ensure that happens. The next slide, Rose, thanks. So what we would recommend is an impact assessment. It really is analysing the data that you've gathered to establish the potential impact of what you're planning on any of the groups and members that are protected under the regulations. So it really is saying, right, we're going to do this. We're going to put a plan together for Clonus Town, and we're going to gather as much information as we have. So first part is who lives here. Are there any groups particularly represented? Maybe there's a high percentage of older people, a high percentage of people from migrant communities. have we identified their needs? Have we considered in a plan that what the end result of this will be won't discriminate against anybody, that there will be equal opportunity, and it reflects an inclusive consultation with the people who live in that community. And it means that basically the money that comes from the Southern Regional Assembly, which comes from the EU, does not land in a community and somebody who is living in that community doesn't have the opportunity to avail of it in the same way as somebody else. So the next one, Rose, thanks. So is it for a group individual protected under the line grounds at a disadvantage compared to other groups or the population? Something as simple as, you want to refine, like, I'm going to just go from previous work in local authorities that maybe it's going to be a community information centre, or maybe a community space. So in that plan that you're going to do, does it provide equal opportunity? Is there anybody at a particular disadvantage? So that would be things like, obviously, physical accessibility, signage. Is signage easy to read, easy to understand? Is information about what you think might happen there? Is it influenced by people who are living in the community because they've had a chance? If there is, a historical attachment to a building that maybe was associated with human rights violations or inequality, acknowledging that from groups and being able to say, okay, this is how we will reflect that, or this is how we will accept that. Is there opportunities for young people, older people? And this is not determined what it is. It's just about, you have to consider it and accommodate and say, okay, well, look, if it's going to be a youth centre, then okay, you recognise that young people have disabilities, there are young traveller people, there are young LGBT community people. So it's recognising that you consider particularly what you're planning to do, and have those needs of a group being met across the line grounds. Accessibility and reasonable accommodation is made for people with a disability. Again, if you don't know, just go and ask people with a disability. They will tell you, if you're planning this, consider this. If you're planning to do this, I really want you to take the time to think about somebody like me who has X, Y, and Z challenges, and these are difficulties I've had in the past. And any activities that are planned, does it promote equality of opportunity for everybody? Next slide, Rose. So how you do that, you inform yourself. So under the legislation of the duty, when we say you must have regard to the need, well, how do you do that? Well, the first thing, you can't remove a barrier until you know what the barrier is. So you inform yourself. What is the data that you already have? Whether that's in your corporate plan, whether it's in the local economic plan, the development plan, an age-friendly strategy, a healthy, whatever plan, is there data available to you that can start the process of identifying some of the barriers that you have to consider and make sure you've addressed? Is there gaps? Are there groups in your community that are protected under the grounds that you actually don't know anything about, and maybe you need to find out? So what about disability tends to be very heavily focused on access and physical spaces. What about people with an intellectual disability? Does the information reach people who maybe don't have reading skills or don't have verbal skills, but live in your community? What gaps do you need? Like, what more information do you need to find out? What data does the data suggest underrepresentation of groups and services in the programme? And do you have information on what stops them engaging? So if you have a consultation session or, previously, and well, we didn't hear anything from migrant women. Well, did you look and see, well, is there particular barriers that prevent migrant women from engaging? Maybe they have care issues, or maybe they work different hours to what that's planned, or maybe they don't have the language. So it's about identifying that you've looked and you're happily informed about the challenges and barriers that may exist for people who are in the community and are protected under the grounds, and that you are taking steps to address any potential issues that are there. The next slide, Rose. Consultation, right across all of the work around the public sector duty consultation. If you put effort into an inclusive consultation process, that you actually take the steps involved to engage with groups, individuals and organizations who experience discrimination, who are left outside, who don't get the opportunity. If you invest in that time, then you will it's a job worth doing, because your assessment of issues and your address of those issues will be informed hugely by engagement of people who experience it. So if you want to find out, well, what can we do to encourage more people from the traveller community to engage in this side, go and ask people from the traveller community what stops them from engaging, and what would work for them. If you want to find out why maybe the young LGBT community don't engage, find out why. Maybe language is used that is a little bit offensive, or maybe something happened in the past. Unless you ask, you won't know, and nobody knows better about how to address and overcome discrimination than people who are experiencing it. And include a feedback mechanism so that you tell people, this is what we're asking you about. We want to put a plan together for this town, or we want to refurbish this building. This is the scope of what we're consulting you about. It's, and it's okay to say that to people. We have a limited budget, we have a limited time, but we want to get your views and then look and see, well, what can we accommodate, but that what you do decide to do provides equality of opportunity. The next slide, Rose, thanks. So just to give you some idea of the kind of things that you might consider. Cultural, language, technology, other barriers that might be relevant. So cultural is, what is a particular culture of do people, listen to the local radio? Is that where they get their information? Do other people have a WhatsApp message? The language that you use, is it clear and easy for people to understand, or is it top heavy, government speak that just people don't understand, and then they're not going to engage with it because they don't understand what it's all about. Technological difficulties. Not everybody knows how to use the internet. Not everybody is comfortable. Not people who have literacy difficulties also have digital literacy difficulties. It's very important to recognize that equality of opportunity means it's not just provided in one way. When we talk about people with a disability, there are sensory disabilities, physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, people with mental health disabilities, and people who have multiple disabilities. Considering the different needs of older people and younger people, and the language and communications and promotions, is it inclusive of the LGBT community? Or do you even know some of the barriers or issues that might prevent members of the LGBT community from engaging in projects or consultation? The next one, Rose, thanks. So when you're looking at that, have you reviewed all the information? So you go and you have, you've had a consultation, you've gathered information that already exists in the council, and you're having a look through and you review, and you're happy that you have the information, and you've identified information in that gathering process that needs to be prioritized. So you go and you do a consultation, and there's a huge recurrence of people saying there's no signage, or we never know what's happening. We never know things happen until they're over, or physical accessibility. So whatever it is, you'll be able to see what is a priority, and that you make sure that that's addressed, and that when you go to prepare budgets and procurements, those equality and human rights issues, where they're relevant, need to be brought into that aspect. To that, the key message is that if you don't know, ask. If you don't know what barriers exist for people who have come from the Ukraine, go and ask them. or engage with groups who are currently working with them and ask them. If you don't know what barriers might exist for people with an intellectual disability, go and ask, ask them, ask the advocacy groups or groups that work with them how best to engage older people, young people. You don't need to know, as I said, in all our work, you don't need to know the answers, but you do need to ask the questions. The next slide, Rose, thanks. So the third step of the duty, we have assess, looking for the issues, address, how are you going to address the issues? And then the third step is reporting. So local authorities, I know from being there, are not very good at actually, highlighting what they do well and taking a slap on the back for, a job well done. So it is important to report on the progress and evaluation of the project. We spoke to the community, we identified these issues, and look, in our report, we're going to highlight that this particular action that we included had a positive outcome for X, Y, and Z. We had 40 people with an intellectual disability engaged in the consultation process. We had migrant women, we had traveller men. Their outcomes, because of the actions that you took at the assessment address stage, when you report, you're saying, because we did this, it has been a positive outcome for people who are protected under the duty, and demonstrates then how you have met the equality and human rights requirements that are set out in the CPR. And I spoke to Rose earlier, so the Regional Assembly are subject to the same regulations as the intermediate bodies and the beneficiaries. So by having the requirements in the application form to demonstrate, that is how the Regional Assembly are ensuring that they've considered the equality and human rights. And then when applications come in, they will be scoring people on how well they have met the human rights and equality requirements. And this morning is about helping you to follow those steps and follow those recommendations, so that when you get to a scoring stage, that you've done it quite well. So look, that's kind of not so much a nutshell, but it's about how you can practically apply the theory of the guidance documents and the regulations to a project. I just know from being in local authorities that you have an enormous amount of information available to you, and structures and community groups and events there that will absolutely take the opportunity to highlight. And some of them you can address, and some of them you might be able to say, well, look, we can make a reasonable accommodation on this, but it's a huge value. And definitely in our work on recognizing where people have had regard, it is about that we can clearly see they have taken time to inform themselves and consider the information that they've received.